and welcome back to part 2 of our podcast on inclusive communication with Alex Luer and Charlie Harris from include.org. In part 1, Alex and Charlie gave us really valuable insight into what they do and what it's like to work at a somewhat more universal level. In this episode, we are going to be talking to Alex and Charlie to find out more about Include as an organisation. Let's jump back in.
So, Alex, as founder and CEO of Include, could you tell us a bit about what Include offers or aims to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I think I alluded to earlier, our vision is a world where nobody is excluded because of understanding and speaking difficulties. And my personal, I guess the reason I've ended up here, I have personal experience of communication needs within my family, which nothing to do with learning disabilities. My father had a brain tumour and had a Broca's aphasia as a result of that. My grandfather had a stroke and had a Wernicke's aphasia. So I saw within a couple of years, when I was in my 20s, I had a very clear insight into how lives could be reduced, affected, and how people could be isolated by both receptive and expressive communication difficulties. So that's always been sort of at the forefront of my mind, I guess, and that's probably why I ended up working in that sort of community setting where I was looking very much at sort of universal work or sort of training work, because in neither situation did the people I love particularly respond well to therapy, and so they needed people to change around them. And at that time, I didn't know how to make that happen, and that just got more and more solidified really as I went through my career, particularly as a safeguarding lead, where we were doing mental capacity assessments and people were signing people off as lacking capacity when they hadn't used any kind of communication support for that person. So in one famous occasion, I remember somebody hadn't even had an interpreter for a lady who had very good capacity if you spoke Italian to her, but not so good if you didn't. So, people just really going through the motions. It's insane, isn't it? But people go through the motions and not think about how fundamental communication is to people's health, people's care, people's lives. And I think it just kind of reached boiling point, and I just got to the point where I thought, well, I've got to stop whinging about this and go and do something about it. So it started with the choir because I had a 1-year-old son at the time. I thought, well, I'll set up the choir and see if that works out. So the aim of the choir was to use those inclusive communication skills, the Makaton, visual support, talking mats, all of those, and to bring them into a community setting where anybody with a learning disability or autism or another communication need could come along with a family member, a support worker, where other members of the community could come along, and where we could all just enjoy singing together, but use the singing as a vehicle to share inclusive communication techniques. Because one of the things that came up in my research was that one of the things which stopped indirect intervention being successful was that training was removed from real life context, that support staff lacked opportunities to see the skills modelled, that they lacked confidence, that the fact that the SLT was only in for a limited period of time and then not seen again was an issue. So I sort of took all those strands and thought, well, how can we do it differently? My first degree was in music, so it seemed sort of fairly obvious. Well, obviously maybe not the right word, but it seemed an opportunity. And so that was where it started, was just a way of developing an experiential model of speech and language therapy. I don't know if that's a real thing yet. It should be. I think I'm hoping to be able to write some more and to publish some more research around Include and explain better what we do. But yeah, that was how it came about, was trying to take speech and language therapy out of clinical settings and a medical model and bring it into a community setting.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And you've mentioned a little bit about the choir, but it's so interesting to hear the link between speech and language and music. And yeah, it would be really interesting to hear a bit more about the choir. And so maybe a first question, what do you think the people who come to the choir get out of it, or get out of being part of, the choir?
I think it's a really good question. We have Our sort of outcome measures are based on a third sector sort of approach, which is a theory of change model. So we're looking at what are the things that we're trying to affect change in, what are we trying to achieve, and we measure across three main strands in addition to communication. So obviously one of the things that we're hoping people get out of it is improved sort of communication skills. But those are not necessarily the things that people coming along are thinking about. And so the three areas that we look at are inclusion, well-being, and empowerment. So within inclusion, we're looking at hopefully the people that come along feel more part of a community, feel they have a bigger voice within the community, make new friends. Within well-being, improved mental health, people feeling happier after they've come to the choir, and within the empowerment, people knowing more about their rights, their inclusive communication rights, because the Mental Capacity Act still, as I keep going on about it, I think it's such an important piece of legislation that's been so massively overlooked. Doesn't help that as a profession we haven't traditionally been involved in it, and that's a whole political discussion for another day. But the fact that people with capacity needs don't know about this legislation, which is out to protect their rights, to say, actually, I have a right to support, to help me understand the decisions about my life. That seems very wrong to me that people don't know that. So we've written a song about it. We sing about it regularly. Our members clamour to sing it on a regular basis. In fact, one member, while still in a secure unit, asked me for the words and the lyrics so that she could teach all the staff there, because she didn't feel that they knew enough about it, which I thought was just a wonderful example of self-advocacy. So those are the things that people tell us that they get out of being with us. Well, increased well-being, increased empowerment, and increased inclusion. And they're all the results of inclusive communication.
Yeah, that's amazing. And just, yeah, to hear about the impact that the choir is having on people's lives is just, yeah, incredible. And yeah, I was also wondering, how is speech and language therapy integrated into the choir? Is it kind of integrated in a specific way, or more, like more general? Yeah.
Shall I take this one, Alex?
I was going to say, yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a bit of both, actually. I think there are some, I think the bulk of the sort of day-to-day stuff that happens in the choir is kind of sneaky speech and language therapy, because people are learning signs as they learn songs. People are learning to work together and to take turns. So even with singing and taking turns and singing in rounds, you know, that those are really turn taking skills as well. And staff coming are learning signs and learning about the value of visual support. So just, you know, when people come into the choir, there's a kind of visual sign-in board where people move their picture to I am here, and there are visual symbols for where the toilets are, and you know, it's there. Inclusive communication is in evidence all the time, even if people don't realize that's what it is. So it's modeling that without being really in your face of you are having speech and language therapy now. Having said that, I think that certainly now that we have this monthly communication corner, that's a much more obvious, this is speech and language therapy. So that's kind of a space where people can ask really specific questions and say, so sometimes I'll take along a load of talking mats and symbols, and members will come and they want to try it out, and they say, well, how does this work, and what do I do with this talking mat? And I show them. And one it was quite a few months ago now, we were doing a piece of work in the choir about, it was for the was it for Alex when we did the This Is Me? It was for the
fundraiser, actually, wasn't it?
Fundraiser, yeah, a big fundraiser based on the song This Is Me, and people so I had some pictures for people to kind of use a talking mat to talk about themselves and what they were interested in. And one lady that comes, she'd done it, and then she sort of said, so what about you? And she did the talking mat on me, and I thought, wow, that's the empowerment that Alex is talking about. This person who has some communication difficulties, but actually says, but I could ask you to use talking mats, and I'll help you tell me. And so I think yeah, obviously having me there and being introduced monthly and going, Charlie's here, she's the speech therapist and she's got communication corner, that's really obvious that there it is. People will come over and ask me specific questions about, I've had all sorts of questions about, is there an app that I can use to help me remember my to-do list, or is there what's the sign for something very random. Often I kind of say, ask Alex, I don't know. Or I've had questions, I've had members come along and ask me, members who don't have a learning disability, come and ask me about a question about how they might support a member of their family who has a different communication difficulty, who doesn't come to choir. So that's really nice, because there's a kind of a mix of the sort of really embedded speech and language therapy, inclusive communication, modeling great skills that happens all the time, and then there's the much more there's a desk at the back of the room, go and ask questions. So yeah, I think that's
no, I think that's a great description. I mean, I should say that the choir isn't our only service, so some have more obvious sort of integrations of SLT than others, I think, probably. But I think that was a great description, Charlie. I love the sneaky speech and language therapy. I used to call it speech and language therapy by stealth, but I think sneaky is probably more accurate. But things like giving people opportunities, so people where they may struggle with initiation. We use objects of reference within the choir because some of our members are non-verbal, or some just are more comfortable with objects than other sort of symbolic communication. So each song has an object of reference, and you watch people over time go from. We had one lady actually who used to sit at the back with her hood over. She didn't used to come in. In fact, she used to be outside the room walking about and didn't come in. And she got to the point where there's one song that she loves so much that she will come in and she will take the object of reference. She will lead the choir at the front. And what we haven't been as good at doing as I would have liked to have been, and it really boiled down to capacity, but now Charlie and I are looking at, is trying to map those individual journeys and on a sort of goal attainment scale basis, because there's been so many changes. We've got another member who just brings so much delight to everybody. She is the bounciest person you've ever seen. She's a bit of a tigger, but she didn't really have any functional speech when she joined us. She's a lady with quite a severe learning disability, and she again was slightly distanced from everything. There was a particular song that was written during the pandemic by one of our members and her mum, and she loves it. And she now, again, she will be at the front, but verbalizing. She's learnt the lyrics and she will say the lyrics ahead of when they come. I remember standing with the mayor and his wife jumping up and down and said, telling them what was coming up. Orange is orange next. And she will take such ownership of that, even to the fact that we got invited to her college to go and teach her class because she loved it so much. She was making them watch it on YouTube so repeatedly. It's called In My World. If you ever see In My World, that's the one that Lucia loves. But so many, they're so different, the journeys. But I think it's very hard for me to think of a member where I haven't seen a marked journey in confidence, in turn taking, in listening, or whatever it is. And within the Champions, within the self-advocacy group, we're very much working on that sort of social skills and pragmatic side. Within the Stroll and Signs, which is our outdoor service, again, the gentleman that Charlie referred to earlier, he's not a natural signer, but he has learned lots of Makaton signs, which he now demonstrates on the video and reminds me that I haven't demonstrated them. So there's just a huge amount of variety in the way that it gets integrated.
That's lovely. It seems like your sneaky approach to SLT creates a much more relaxed atmosphere for members. But as you've mentioned, you don't just work directly with disabled people, you also offer training and consulting opportunities, is that right? And if I understand correctly, those are intended to help organisations meet their legal responsibilities towards people with understanding and speaking difficulties. Before we go into more questions, I just wanted to outline, in case people aren't already familiar with the Mental Capacity Act and are still a bit unclear about what it is. It was designed to empower people who may lack the mental capacity to make their own decisions about their care and treatment, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So could you tell us a bit more about your work with the non-clinical or like wider population? Like, who are you targeting with your training, Alex?
Well, that's a good question, and probably I'm guilty of trying to target things too widely sometimes because I think everybody needs it. But with the Mental Capacity Act and inclusive communication side of it, mostly it's mainly looking at clinical staff, and that's been different groups. So I've worked with safeguarding link nurses to make sure that they know how to use the various tools which might help get information, help to assess people. I've worked with AHPs, so groups of AHPs, because again, this is to anybody listening, the Mental Capacity Act might sound daunting, but as a speech and language therapist, you're already way up on the ladder in terms of understanding it and being able to implement it. And it just means making sure that you've given people a chance to express themselves and understand. So there's lots of kind of different clinical groups. We've worked with junior doctors as well in the past. But yes, anybody who's maybe got that legal responsibility but doesn't feel confident in getting out some visual supports, changing the time of day that they go and assess somebody's capacity, taking a bit more time, repeating themselves, providing an app, giving somebody a kinesthetic experience that will help them understand. It's anybody within any clinical setting needs to have those skills legally, because we all may be in a position where we need to assess whether somebody has capacity to consent to treatment, care and treatment, or any other aspect of their lives. We've done it less often in social care, but it's another area that comes up an awful lot in discussion, and is probably needed more, I think, as well there. But yeah, I hope that sort of answered the question. Sorry, I lost myself there, but I think, Charlie, if I missed something.
No, I don't think so. I think, yeah, it's everyone. Everyone is the target. Anyone and everyone.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. And so maybe, Charlie, you could answer my next question. Why do you think this part of your job is so important? I know we've already touched upon it, but if you could summarize.
I think Alex has touched on it a bit, but I guess I think because communication is so fundamental to every aspect of life, that if the people that are supporting those who have difficulties with communication don't understand what the challenges can be, B, how to support them, and C, what they should be doing both legally and kind of just to provide a good service, then we can't reduce the barriers that these people experience. So I think raising awareness and developing people's skills is just, it's really fundamental, because I think whatever we do as SLTs one-to-one with people, it's kind of a drop in the ocean of the impact that we need to have, because we're just there for a short time. So it doesn't really matter if we come along with our wonderful communication skills and help people feel listened to and empowered. Everyone else needs to be doing it. And I just think there isn't really a facet of life that doesn't need good communication. So it's care staff, it's hospital staff, it's people working in shops, it's people working in banks. Everybody needs to be able to understand how to communicate well with people that have difficulties. So it kind of, sometimes when I think about it as I'm talking, I'm kind of thinking it's the most important thing that we could be doing, actually, because I guess if everybody in the world communicated really well with people that had communication difficulties, we wouldn't need as much direct speech and language therapy, because everyone would be accepted for how they are, and it wouldn't be kind of, oh, we must rehab you and get you better, and you must change how you're doing things, or you must do things differently. We're gonna support everybody however they communicate.
Absolutely. And I think, sorry, I'm probably going back on myself a little bit, but I think something that we'd really love to do and include, or I'd really love to do, is get more involved with more mainstream organisations, because we do all have that responsibility. And if students aren't aware of Communication Access UK, do look that up. That's a national, I'm sure you are, but national programme, but not as many organisations are aware of it as should be. And we work sometimes with solicitors and legal firms, and it's absolutely fundamental. How can you possibly support somebody unless you know how to get the best out of their communication? And again, I don't know whether you'll want to use this or not because it's slightly in a different tone, but I just have an example of one of the times where communication support was not used and not observed, which had a really devastating outcome. And so when I was in my first job as an SLT, I worked with a lady who was dysphagic, and funnily, she was originally referred, they believed there was some diagnostic overshadowing, so the psychiatrist believed that she had a lot of anxiety around meal times, and actually what transpired was that she had very frank aspiration during meal times, and that what looked like anxiety was genuine breathing difficulties because of her dysphagia. And this lady had been in a long stay institution for a long time. She was in her 70s. She'd been given a lot of antipsychotic medications, which was quite common in the treatment, and sadly still is more common than it should be in the treatment of people with learning disabilities. If people aren't familiar with STOMP, which is the stop the over medication of people with disabilities, do look them up. But this lady was, living proof of why it's important to communicate with people and not to medicate them, because a lot of her behaviours had been communication behaviours. So she was living with the consequences of this. And we did a lot of work around her capacity around dysphagia, because she did not like thickener. She really didn't like thickener. She didn't like pureed foods. And she was absolutely adamant she didn't want them. And although that's the dysphagia side, from the communication side, we spent a lot of time with talking mats, assessing her capacity. Did she understand? We knew she didn't like them, but did she know what could happen if not? And she was really, really clear. She did not want a peg. She did not want the most modified food. She was happier with the free water protocol, although that wasn't really a thing there then. But we did this massive piece of work working around her capacity, listening to her where people hadn't done so, and writing it all out. And she developed aspiration pneumonia several times, as was inevitable. But she went into hospital, and the last time she went into hospital, nobody spoke to her because she had a communication need. None of the doctors bothered to find out what she really wanted. They didn't read the piece of work that we'd spent ages and ages putting together. And she was given a peg, and she woke up with a tube that she had never wanted, which she then inevitably pulled out several times, was hugely distressed in the environment, and the worst possible outcome, she didn't survive after that or afterwards. And I'm sorry, and I know most of Include is upbeat. We want to be upbeat, and we want to bring fun as a learning tool. But that experience and my experience, other experiences like that, are what underpin how important it is that everybody understands what inclusive communication looks like, how we communicate with people when they're at their most vulnerable. Because you only needed somebody within that hospital team to have actually stopped and thought and looked at how they could engage, and that lady could have had a very different end of life. So apologies for a slightly different tone there, but talking to people and educating people on the widest possible scale is really, really important.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that, because it's a heartbreaking story, but it really does show and really hammer home the importance of what you're doing. It's not just a nice idea and extra, it's really the foundation. Like it should be a given that we take people's opinions and wants into consideration. And yeah, I just wanted to add also, I did the communication access training in a previous role. I can really vouch for it. I know that it's a good, short, digestible training. So yeah, if anyone is out there listening, not in an SLT role, or maybe they are and they're just interested, I would really, check it out, because it really, can change your perspective on how you approach conversations with people who have communication difficulties.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really is so true that inclusive communication is for everybody. And to finish the podcast, I have a final question for both of you. What would be one thing that you want listeners to know or take away from this episode, whether that's SLTs listening or student SLTs, or just anyone else listening who's interested in inclusive communication?
Ooh. I've got several things, I think. That's always too many. Charlie, do you have anything succinct that you can
I guess thinking about what we've been talking about through this episode, I think the thing that I really would like people to take away from it is that people with communication difficulties, people with learning disabilities or with autism have far more capability than they are assumed to have. And that sometimes they just need us to communicate well and inclusively with them. And then they have so much to give. And they can be such wonderful people to interact with and learn from. So I think that just that to not assume that people don't have some really wonderful things and personalities and experiences and skills to share if they're given the opportunity.
That
would be
brilliant point. That's so true, Charlie. Thank you. And I think my other sort of takeaway is don't underestimate. It's a bit similar to what I said earlier, I suppose, but don't underestimate your ability to pull out what communication really is, because sometimes it can seem like inclusive communication is really obvious. Certainly, I think when you've been doing it a long time, it's like, well, everybody knows that. And everybody may know that, but they don't instinctively use those skills. Sometimes anxiety or time or whatever can stop people, being as good a communicator as they can be. So never feel that you don't have something as a speech and language therapist or speech and language therapy student where you can help somebody, you can help someone be a better communicator, a better communication partner. Because over the years, I've really learned that what has seemed blindingly obvious to me might not be to somebody else, and vice versa.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, great takeaways. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you so much, Alex and Charlie, for joining us today on the podcast. It's been so interesting to talk to you and just to hear more about Include and the amazing things Include does. And it's just been so great to hear just the huge impact Include is having on the lives of people involved. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for all that you do and just all the hard work in advocating for inclusive communication.
Thanks for listening, everyone. In this episode, we mentioned Communication Access UK and Include.org's YouTube channel, where you can find videos of their choir. The links to these are in the description of this episode. And if you like the sound of what Include.org does, you might be interested to hear that they offer volunteering opportunities. Volunteers help create the easy read information they produce and can access their Mental Capacity Act training and Makaton training. If anyone is interested in volunteering, check out their website for more information. You can find the link in the description. Alternatively, please head to their website if you or anyone else you know is keen to donate.